over 46 months, Russia is waging war on Ukraine. Today we want to examine the military situation in the country. I'm Julian Röpke and this is Build Situation Room. We begin in northeastern Ukraine in Kharkiv. A new Ukrainian army video shows that Russia is still with very few men in the former occupied city of Kupjansk. For the propaganda, they still claim control over the former city of 26,000 people, but that control is made up. We're looking at the footage from Brigade Khartia and we can see a building here. It's the former city council in Kharkiv. And we can see that this is in Kupjansk, of course, and we can also plainly make out further details that this building is now the focus of the Ukrainian forces because we can see the drones haven't just been monitoring it, they're now also involved in the fight for the old town. The old town that is the completely destroyed old town of Kupiansk, where Ukrainian units of the Khartia Brigade can move relatively freely. We see the whole thing really from the perspective, on the one hand from the soldiers' helmet cams who are involved, but also again and again from drones circling overhead and securing it. And that shows this urban combat, fighting in the city or urban areas, what it's like on the ground up close and in vivid detail. And we can see how unbelievably dangerous that is for the Ukrainians, who are basically always trying to run pretty quickly from house to house, then take cover again at the next building, which is fairly open. But at this point, there are still Russian soldiers inside the city council building itself right now, in the so-called Rada of Kupjansk. We can see that inside the last building, there were still Russian soldiers at that time, clearly visible in the footage as armed personnel moving about and conducting patrols, who are now being spotted by the drones. We can now see kamikaze drone strikes on that very city parliament, which was indeed still held by the Russians at that very time. And they're basically trying now to clear out the last building that's still being held by the occupying forces. They've already pushed forward through the city center streets to be relatively close by right now, staying in proximity. Finally, we'll see the fight inside this building. Those are rather odd and somewhat weird shots. They're shooting at very close range here. We actually don't see any Russian soldiers. So it's not 100% clear. Now we see Ukrainians near the city council. Not 100% clear whether the whole thing was really a fight or if you should just play it safe, just to be sure. Now we can definitely see shots still being fired inside the building, how the Ukrainians are making sure they're really the only ones in the building. And then in the end, that what we've seen recently, sadly mainly from the Russians, namely the raising the flag on top of the city council building, displaying both the unit's flag and the Ukrainian flag, a clear public show of presence, allegiance and intent. And you can pretty clearly see the Ukrainian forces standing in front of the building, which means the city council of Kupjansk is once again under Ukrainian control. At the same time, there are still Russian soldiers in the city and they're being hunted by Ukrainians. Let's take a look at the footage. So here we can also see very similar buildings and in some places even sturdier ones. Up to 10 stories high, now under Russian control. We'll view that on the map in a moment. And there the Ukrainians are trying to advance using kamikaze drones. The whole thing is of course fairly difficult because you can't really operate here anymore with say MiG-29s or the bombs supplied from France or the US, since you're pretty close to the front line. Because large parts of the city are back under the control of the Ukrainian army, leaving only the last Russian soldiers holding out here. They're talking about up to 200 being attacked fairly accurately, fairly precisely, with bomber drones or kamikaze drones all around them. But all this clearly shows us once again that there are still Russian soldiers stationed in Kupjansk. However, the majority of the city, including the approaches to the city and the city's central area, are under Ukrainian control. And we can also see all of that on the map from our map provider, Deep State Map. There you can see that the majority of the city is now blue, meaning blue has actually been retaken by Ukraine once again, in fact. However, there are still orange areas and some red ones. The red areas are where the Russians remain dug in, where they're still holding their positions firmly in place. And that's basically once in the north of the city, once down here in the south, in that high-rise district we just saw, and south of the center. What we just saw, the radar that was liberated, the city radar is located right here now on the Oskil River, so the whole thing is pretty straightforward and very easy to follow overall. So the videos we just saw are also reflected in the current maps of, and I have to keep saying this, pro-Ukrainian map providers too, really. From Kupjansk in Kharkiv, we go to Pokrovsk in Donetsk. The situation there is different. The Russians control most of Pokrovsk, which used to have about 65,000 people. However, they aren't safe there, as we can see from this footage. We have to keep pixelating the whole thing because these are actually recordings that show that. More than 200 Russian soldiers die every day in Ukraine. Those are awful images, and pretty awful numbers, of course, from a human perspective and for the Kremlin, but numbers that can actually be backed up by those very videos we're watching right here now. We can only ever show a tiny fraction, because most of it is really just way too brutal to watch. About 200 Russians die every day, and the Ukrainians simply stand by and watch the whole thing helplessly. Many of those Russians, we know this, about 90% right now are being killed by kamikaze drones, only around 10% by small arms or artillery or the like. And so the Ukrainians see almost every Russian soldier die, and they also post those recordings on their own channels for the public to see. So here we're looking at the period from the 1st to the 11th of January. The whole thing is basically from the 7th onward. This describes a core of the Ukrainian army, and it's over 500 Russians they claim to have killed by this unit just in Pokrovsk during that time. And all of this is basically being shown to us here as video evidence. For the Ukrainians, it's also really important to post these proofs because, in fact, the military support that they receive, from their various units, even the budgets they get are largely tied to being able to prove they used the money to kill Russian soldiers on the front lines in real combat operations. That they also killed them with drones, with the ammunition, and that the whole thing hasn't basically just vanished through corruption or something like that. So it's also militarily important for the Ukrainians, not just for PR, to show we've achieved tangible battlefield results with the money and weapons sent by our partners and that they're being used effectively on the front lines. But we're still looking at the situation in Pokrovsk on the map, and we can see it hasn't improved for the Ukrainian army. It's actually gotten worse. We can see, yes, a lot of Russian soldiers are dying over there in Pokrovsk, but it doesn't have any strategic impact here in the city. Yes, the Ukrainians say they still control a small part, the northern part of the city, at least for now, according to their reports they maintain. The tracks run almost parallel to the railway line right through here, basically side by side, really. And the Ukrainians claim that until recently, the city had basically been split. The southern two-thirds south of the tracks would be under Russian control, or the northern third under Ukrainian control. What we see on this map, and again, deep state map, is pro-Ukrainian, but also very realistic. That's why we keep using those map providers. North of the rail line, we also have neighborhoods, and bigger ones that are completely dark red. There, the Russian army holds firm control. We can easily see these big orange areas, which means there are now and then Ukrainian soldiers there at any given time, maybe a small presence of a few isolated individuals or perhaps a few dozen in some basements. However, the Ukrainians can hardly move around there at all. The Russians, as we just saw, are moving around in huge convoys, traveling with their buses. They've moved into the apartments of the 65,000 displaced people there, basically settled in, and are now launching further coordinated attacks from there. We've been saying that over and over in recent days and weeks. The next targets are Hryshyn on the northwest side and Rodinsky to the north of Pokrovsk. So those are the next two towns the Russian army plans to attack from Pokrovsk in the very near future soon. And it's not just in Donetsk that the Russian army is gaining ground. Further south in Zaporizhzhia, we've got footage showing Russia has taken another small village under its control. We're looking at footage that once again opens with the really brutal violence Russia is unleashing. It's worth saying again, and before the first Russian soldier even sets foot there, before the kamikaze drones are used, there are always the big attacks with guided glide bombs, sometimes even with ballistic missiles fired at suspected Ukrainian positions there, often followed by heavy munitions and continued bombardment. We're still seeing very brutal footage that we absolutely have to pixelate because you can see the Russians are also attacking individual Ukrainians in the trench systems here, which then leads to the deaths of the Ukrainian soldiers who had been sheltering there in those positions and dugouts. The whole thing is really pretty gruesome footage, but it shows us that for the individual village, the Ukrainians, if the Russian army really puts a lot into it, so they pour most resources into it, have little chance of holding villages. We also see attacks on logistics again, meaning not just the soldiers who are there, but reinforcements are being attacked. The possible supply routes, which partly include convoys and vehicles and transport units, which in part are these robotic systems. And in the end, we then have those typical images, in this case from the small town of Zeleny here, of the Russians hoisting their flag there and once more showing this little village wasn't just completely emptied, it wasn't just completely destroyed. As you can see in the end, from the Russian point of view, they also managed to drive out or kill the Ukrainian defenders in and around Zeleny. And so this is another village under Russian control. Let's take a look at it on the map. Want to see exactly where Zeleny is located and where the Russians are heading, because there are actually over 50 villages called Zeleny in Ukraine. So it's a very popular name. In this case, we're talking about this little village right here, just a little bit further north of Haljaipol on the map right now. We already know that Haljaipol was captured several weeks ago by the Russian military. I have to say, deep state map is pretty optimistic here since the whole area is still shown as contested, but there haven't been any signs of that for a few days now, or about a week, you could say. Rather, much like in Pokrovsk, the Russians are consolidating their hold and are currently trying to attack the next Ukrainian towns, one of them being Salizhnychne here right this very moment. Zalesnichne is also an important former rail hub, so there's industry there, the tracks run through it, and therefore it's the next point. Unlike Zeleny, this small village can still be held by the Ukrainians, who have firm positions here and can operate from there in the greater Zaporizhzhia area. They'll at least try to continue holding it for the time being. In Hulchachpol and in Pokrovsk, unlike in Kupjansk, recaptures are not currently being seriously discussed. And we've got more footage from Zaporizhzhia, from southern Ukraine, showing exactly how the Russians are operating there. These are clips you won't see in Russian propaganda, where everything always looks so systematic, so disciplined. Specifically footage showing 2 unarmored vehicles, apparently oblivious to the danger, driving straight into a Ukrainian minefield. You can see it right here. There are 2 vehicles in total from the Russian forces, both now moving in this direction toward the northwest. And it's once more the same situation we've been talking about. It really seems the Russian soldiers have completely switched their heads off here. They're just orders you follow totally regardless of whether you risk your life or even end up losing it, with no questions asked whatsoever. We're about to see a mine detonate beneath the first vehicle, which already ends up causing a number of casualties right here on the spot. We'll have to pixel that out again in a sec, because, well, you can see there have probably already been fatalities here. Let's not forget, these vehicles usually have an extra 4 to 6 people in them, with passengers packed tightly. We can now see that 2 people appear to have survived and are fleeing in different directions. One here is on fire, heading southeast toward the other vehicle, and the other looks only slightly wounded, limping and stumbling while weakly calling for help. Here we see him a bit further north. And the incredible thing is that the second vehicle, even though they'd just seen it and the crew, the driver, clearly saw something happen, that there's a minefield and we should stop, he still drives straight toward the situation, keeps driving exactly his route just like before, and now we see it. Just before the wounded burning soldier reaches the vehicle, the next mine blows up under the next vehicle, and so once again we have a Russian vehicle loss of 100%, and as for infantry at this stage we can only reasonably speculate, but probably 70 to 80% just from this one single attack. What is Russia doing to compensate for its massive losses in Ukraine and to secure fresh cannon fodder? They're active in Africa. They're extremely active in several African countries, trying there through the Wagner mercenaries, who have had established structures there for several years, to get new soldiers to the front. And we see these soldiers here, among other places in Ukraine, who are currently preparing for their upcoming deployment as we speak at the moment. We can see soldiers here. They've been identified singing folk songs, battle songs from Uganda. So it's a country where Wagner is active. What we can't hear right now, though the subtitles show it, is that Russian soldiers are filming the entire scene and openly mocking it on camera. That the Ugandans here are even having a laugh, singing and dancing, and they're basically saying you're disposable and mean absolutely nothing to them. And these disposable items are still having so much fun, and that fun will soon be over, the singing and all, because they'll very soon be sent off to their respective fronts in short order. They are unaware that they are going to die, and every Russian soldier knows full well that those African mercenaries were only deliberately brought in to die. So it's not that they make any big difference, it's just that you use Russians, who you need for it every day, and you've already sacrificed many of them, that they're now partly replacing them with Africans who are supposed to storm the Ukrainian positions. And these are soldiers who don't just operate drones, who don't fly planes or even drive tanks, but are the assault troops who are supposed to go forward on the front line, to break open the Ukrainian positions there or to fight them directly, all the while facing roughly a 90% chance of death. Some of them were already sent on those missions, then realized what was happening, and the mood there is completely different from what we just saw, noticeably so indeed overall. They're no longer cheerful, singing and dancing. They know in their bones deep down they're truly only there to die. And a really gruesome punishment for those soldiers who eventually realize what's actually going on. We'll see the Africans who no longer want to fight there in the next short video clip. And this was also posted by Russian soldiers. Here we see another black African who goes by Francis, and he's being punished right now by the Russian soldiers in this footage, apparently being visibly and openly disciplined on camera. And in this video he's even called by Russian soldiers, quote, opener or can opener or bottle opener. That's what they repeatedly call him again. And this is someone who's got a mine, we can see it here, a TM62 anti-tank mine strapped around his waist. Whose? Being basically forced into the Ukrainian position. This mine either has an impact fuse or is triggered remotely. In any case, this man is left with no real alternative but to either sacrifice himself by physically entering the Ukrainian bunker or be shot beforehand. We can see it. Then it became clear this isn't voluntary. The young man is being led out now. I raise my hands and we see, there it is, the assault rifle behind him. That means the Russian soldier makes it unmistakably clear, either you sacrifice yourself now for this mission or we'll kill you beforehand. All those really gruesome images that show us how Russia is waging its war against Ukraine completely without any respect and with total disregard for human life. Not even for their own soldiers, and certainly not for Africans, some of whom were lured into Ukraine under very strange pretenses by being told, you can get a good job here. In the end, they were told, well, no, and then just left to fend for themselves. Surprise, the job turned out to be the army, and the job there is to die. Some of them may have known that beforehand. That's not always clear at the last moment. Like when the mercenaries get captured or end up in Ukrainian custody, each of them says they didn't really want to fight. You can see in the footage those people dancing and singing there in Russian uniforms, visibly. Some of them definitely know what they're doing there. Finally, let's take a look at long-range strikes from both sides. First up, we'll examine Russian long-range strikes on Ukrainian targets in more detail. And these long-range strikes show, once again, the Russians have absolutely no qualms at all about targeting civilian infrastructure and essential services. Here we have footage of the special unit Rubicon. We know it's one of Russia's best drone units, and this Rubicon unit built the so-called Italmus drone by themselves. This is a drone that's a bit smaller than the Shahed, but it can be steered onto its target right up until the last second. And we can see that it's always these tanks being attacked, but they're not fuel tanks or gas tanks or anything like that. They're sunflower oil. So these are purely civilian goods produced here in Ukraine, which in part still more or less keep the Ukrainian economy going and help sustain local livelihoods indeed. You can see, so it's marked here, and now the Russians are about to take material we showed a few days ago, namely from eyewitnesses. Here we can see it. I hope you can see it. Let's pause for a second. Here we see the drone coming in, the one that's flying at it. So that's the Italmus drone that was filmed by people in Dnipro and also by the Russians from their own side as well, incidentally. They're really proud to show, yes, we attack civilian infrastructure, and they even flaunt it openly and proudly. This is a total war against Ukraine. It's not just about the military, it's aimed at the entire economy, cultural life, the civilian population, and many other facets of national life and daily existence. We see in Russia, they are carrying out these attacks. In some cases, as shown here, military facilities are also attacked. You've got to say, from a purely technical point of view, it's a pretty interesting drone and a pretty successful one too, each with a camera and guidance right up to the last moment. These delta-winged drones they're using here. In other cases, as we also see at the end of the video, it's then only about civilian units. You see, the Russians make no distinction. They hit military sites. So in a way, it's legitimate within the context of an illegal war of aggression, you have to say. On the other hand, you can immediately see it's also aimed at all sorts of other structures and institutions besides those, really, as well indeed. These structures can include cargo ships. You can see that here as well. So this is another Russian attack on a cargo ship in the Black Sea. Here we see the approach, and that's a ship that was carrying soybeans under the Panamanian flag, which was simply anchored there, idly waiting for orders or clearance from port authorities. And the second ship you'll see soon, here it is, a grain freighter, also in Chornomorsk or Odessa indeed. I don't remember exactly. In any case, it's absolutely clear as well. And there's food being exported from Ukraine, among other places, to Africa and other parts of the world. And the Russians are attacking those shipments fully, knowingly and deliberately, and are even proud of striking these transports and that big freighter here, openly boasting about it and using it as propaganda in their videos, publicly celebrating it. But it's not only Russia attacking critical infrastructure, as we just saw, Ukraine does too. And one of these attacks this time went extremely far. It hit oil and gas platforms in the Caspian Sea. We'll look at it on the map in a bit. So here is footage from the Ukrainian military intelligence showing that using truly extremely long-range drones, they attacked Russia's oil and gas platforms well out in the wider Caspian Sea region. The whole thing was an attack the Russians wouldn't have expected because it happened several hundred, or I think even over 1,000 kilometers away from the front. And if people have, up until now, regarded the Caspian Sea and the oil extraction there as safe, but these images clearly show that Ukraine is indeed able to use its long-range drones to strike them precisely, reliably, and effectively. Again, we can see the camera being remotely controlled until the very last moment, so we assume these are truly extremely long distances. With the Italmus, it's about 160 kilometers, so you can still do it over radio or with SIM cards. Ukrainian SIMs you pop in now and then. Here it's probably more like they use Starlink or something similar mounted on the drone, so you can still keep an eye on everything from extremely far away from Ukraine, relaying live data back. We also want to check that on the map to see exactly how far away Ukraine actually was when it attacked those oil and gas platforms. And now you can see it pretty clearly. Up there in the corner, we've got the distance marker. It's always roughly 200 kilometers. So If we look at the 3 platforms that were attacked, every one of them was clearly identified by their silhouettes. That's easily 1,000 or maybe 1,500 kilometers to the front, so very large distances they covered there. You can't do that by radio anymore. The Russians have very strong electronic warfare. But we also see that Ukraine is able to fly over Rostov, over Volgograd, over Novorossiysk, over all those Russian coastal areas, and then, well, continue heading even further inland afterwards. Even though the whole thing should theoretically be very heavily defended, and then go on to directly attack that installation in the Caspian Sea. And in doing so, Ukraine is trying, more or less successfully, you have to be honest, to deal a rather serious and quite likely lasting blow to the Russian war economy.